The Ming Dynasty didn't just build a wall, they built an obsession with permanence. This is Jiayuguan Pass, 36 feet of vertical stone, 3 layers of defenses, and iron-clad gates. It wasn't a barrier. It was a 16th century kill zone, 5,000 miles to the west. European engineers were chasing the same dream of invincibility. This is the Star Fort, a geometric masterpiece where every angle is calculated to absorb the shock of a cannonball and leave an attacker with nowhere to hide. For a century, these works were the most formidable structures on Earth. They were the peak of static defense. But their immense physical power hid a structural flaw programmed into the very logic of their design. Every 13-kilogram brick in every diamond-shaped bastion was an investment that required a debt the empires of the 16th century could never truly repay. History tells us these walls were breached by invaders. The truth is far more clinical. They didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they were too strong to survive. In the geometry of power, a system that cannot bend under pressure is destined to shatter under its own weight. These fortresses didn't just protect empires, they exhausted them. To understand why the Ming Dynasty doubled down on an 8,851.8-kilometer linear wall while Europe was shrinking its defenses into compact polygons, you have to look past the stone. Most people see the Great Wall as a simple barrier. But for the Ming, it was a 16th century version of a high-speed data network. Every watchtower along its 7.8-meter-high frame acted as a signal node. Using a sophisticated system of 64 unique combinations of smoke and fire signals, intelligence on an incoming raid could travel hundreds of miles in a single day, far faster than any nomadic cavalry could move. This was 16th century radar. The Ming used 64 unique smoke and fire signals to weaponize geography itself. Information moved faster than a nomadic cavalry could ride. Surprise! The nomad's greatest weapon was dead. The Ming held every card in this game. But dominance comes at a cost. However, this peak of linear efficiency functioned much like a modern legacy system. It was masterfully engineered to solve the problems of the past. But its sheer scale made it impossible to pivot when gunpowder artillery began to rewrite the rules of engagement in the West. While the Ming were scaling mountain ridges to expand their reach, Europe was forced to sink its defenses into the ground. After the French invasion of Italy in 1494, the traditional rules of war vanished as tall, vertical castle walls that had stood for centuries suddenly shattered under the impact of modern gunpowder artillery. The response was a radical shift in geometry known as the Trace Italienne. These star forts weren't designed to look down on an enemy, but to survive them. Engineers traded height for thickness, replacing perpendicular stone towers with low-slung ramparts built of brick and earth specifically to absorb and deflect the kinetic energy of a cannonball. The diamond-shaped bastions changed everything. Old round towers had dead zones, blind spots where you could hide right under the wall. Geometry fixed that. Those jagged angles meant every inch of the perimeter was in someone's crosshairs. Try to storm one bastion, and the neighbors on both sides would shred your line. This system of mutual defense meant that if an army attempted to storm one bastion, they were simultaneously caught in a lethal crossfire from the bastions to their left and right. It transformed the fortress from a passive barrier into an active, interlocking machine. This was a perfect, self-reinforcing loop of design. It was so effective at creating a military stalemate that it essentially froze the map of Europe as sieges became incredibly long and expensive. However, this level of mathematical precision came with a staggering price tag. The Ming Wall was built with muscle and sweat, a centralized empire mobilizing millions by decree. But the Star Fort? That required gold, massive, liquid capital. It wasn't enough to build these geometric giants. You had to pay for the engineers to design them and the credit to sustain them. Cities like Siena and Amsterdam didn't just build walls. They built debt. Cities like Siena and Amsterdam spent millions of florins, sometimes bankrupting themselves just to keep their geometric edges sharp. It was a military evolution that traded human labor for financial debt, setting the stage for a new kind of institutional strain that was as invisible as it was dangerous. The Great Wall wasn't just a physical barrier, it was an administrative monster. Maintaining 8,851.8 kilometers of stone and brick required a level of mobilization that would eventually suffocate the Ming state. To man these defenses, the empire relied on a massive system of corvée labor, forcing millions of people into a life of brutal construction and remote border duty. While the wall's 7.8-meter-high frame and 13-kilogram bricks looked indestructible from the outside, the internal foundation was cracking under the weight of its own human cost. The system was rigid. It couldn't adapt to the rising costs of a long-term blockade, turning the wall into a resource sink that drained the imperial treasury year after year. Europe's weakness wasn't in the bricks, it was in the ledgers. These forts were financial black holes. Amsterdam dropped 11 million florins on its defenses. Siena went bankrupt in 1544 just to finish the job. These were pure military machines. No shops, no houses, just a massive debt with zero return on investment. The strength of the Star Fort was built on debt. It forced states to develop complex banking systems just to pay for their survival, creating a financial vulnerability that an enemy didn't even need to touch to exploit. Two civilizations, two different currencies, but the same dead end. The Ming were spending human lives for a line in the sand. The Europeans were mortgaging their financial future for a few extra degrees of defensive fire. Whether paid in blood or in gold, security is never a product. It is a high-interest loan that eventually demands the soul of the state. Both were trapped. They had built monsters they could no longer feed. They were trapped in a cycle of maintenance they couldn't afford to stop. The very structures designed to ensure permanence were now the primary drivers of institutional exhaustion. By the early 17th century, the pressure on both systems was moving from the battlefield to the balance sheet. In China, the Ming Dynasty was trapped by the sheer scale of its own creation. Maintaining a continuous 8,851.8 kilometer line required a permanent mobilization of hundreds of thousands of troops and millions of laborers. Every 13-kilogram brick carried the weight of a state that had to prioritize the wall over every other economic or social necessity. This was not just a defensive strategy, it was an administrative black hole. Recent spatial analyses suggest that as the military cost became unbearable, the wall's primary function underwent a systemic shift. It morphed from a shield into an instrument of economic extraction, designed to restrict the movement of merchants and herdsmen alike. The objective was no longer just survival, but the forced stabilization of the tax base to fund the wall's own astronomical maintenance. The empire was no longer just defending against cavalry, it was struggling to sustain a structure that had become its own primary predator. Across the Mediterranean, European powers were facing a different kind of structural exhaustion. The Italienne had successfully created a military stalemate, but it did so by trading blood for gold. Because these star-shaped fortresses were purely military installations with no residential or economic value. They were massive sinks for liquid capital. The cost of building and garrisoning these geometric giants forced small Italian states and northern European cities to develop the precursors of modern central banking just to manage the debt. Amsterdam's defensive expansion cost a staggering 11 million florins, while the city-state of Siena literally bankrupted itself in 1544 trying to stay ahead of the artillery curve. The pressure was cumulative and invisible. The Ming were being crushed by the weight of an inflexible administrative hierarchy, while Europe was being strained by the rising cost of a competitive arms race. Both civilizations had built structures so advanced and so expensive that they could no longer afford the peace they were designed to protect. The collapse was no longer a question of if an enemy would break in, but when the internal pressure would finally cause the system to buckle. The invincibility myth died in 1661. Koxinga arrived at Formosa with 25,000 men and one goal: take it back. Fort Zeelandia stood in his way, a textbook star fortress, built to be a geometric fortress. On paper, it was a stalemate. In reality, it was a trap. Its Dutch defenders believed the Chinese forces would inevitably break against the geometric precision of the Italienne. At first, the geometry held. It worked exactly as programmed. During the massive assault in May, Dutch gunners unleashed a storm of musket balls and nails. shredding the advancing regiments before they could even reach the wall. The interlocking fire was perfect. The bastions were lethal. But invincibility is a fragile illusion. The interlocking fire from the symmetrical bastions left the attackers with no cover, forcing Koxinga to abandon direct confrontation. This is where the hidden fragility of the static system surfaced. The Star Fort was a masterpiece of survival. But it was also a trap. As the siege stretched into months, the Dutch remained isolated within their perfect walls, while hunger and disease did the work the cannons could not. The turning point came through the exposure of a single structural flaw rather than a superior weapon. A German defector named Hans-Jürgen Radius, who understood the mechanics of European fortresses, showed the Chinese how to neutralize the fort's advantages. Under his guidance, the Chinese built sophisticated siege works and a demi-lune positioned in a blind spot that the fort's guns could not reach. They targeted the redoubt of Utrecht, a vital fortification on a nearby dune that commanded the high ground over the main fort. Once the Chinese captured this position and turned their cannons on the interior of Zeelandia, the geometric stalemate collapsed. The surrender of the fort in 1662 demonstrated that even the most advanced static defense is vulnerable to persistence and structural knowledge. The fortress lost more than a battle. It provided the ultimate evidence that the era of the invincible wall was over. The defeat at Zeelandia was the sound of an entire era of military thinking finally breaking under its own weight. By the mid-17th century, both the Great Wall and the Star Fort had arrived at a structural dead end. The Ming Dynasty was trapped in a maintenance loop that prioritized the preservation of a static line over the survival of the state itself. Each year, the 8,851.8-kilometer system demanded astronomical sums of silver and millions of hours of labor to patch crumbling brickwork and man thousands of isolated nodes. It had become a money-burning project, a system so vast it consumed the very resources needed to adapt to a changing world. While the Ming were scaling cliffs to maintain a linear paradigm, the nature of warfare was shifting toward field armies and rapid movement. The wall's 7.8-meter-high frame was optimized for a specific type of nomadic threat that was being replaced by organized, gunpowder-equipped forces. Once the system was breached, either through technical sapping or political betrayal, the entire multi-billion-dollar investment became an expensive spectator to the empire's internal collapse. In Europe, the structural breakdown was equally inevitable. The Trace Italienne had made sieges so expensive and time-consuming that wars became decades-long financial stalemates. The value of a fortress was no longer its invulnerability, but the high price in money and time it forced the enemy to pay. But eventually, that price became too high for the defenders as well. By the 19th century, the advent of explosive artillery shells rendered the geometric bastions obsolete. The low, thick walls that once absorbed solid cannonballs were now shattered by industrial-age explosives. The true collapse, however, was institutional. In Fort Zeelandia, the final months weren't marked by heroic defense, but by filth, disease, and the breakdown of human order. The fort was filled with waste. The garrison was decimated by scurvy and diarrhea, and the command structure was dissolving into brawls and drinking bouts. The system's supposed invincibility had become its greatest liability. These fortresses didn't just fail, they exhausted the social and financial logic of the civilizations that built them. The legacy of these stone and brick giants isn't found in their ruins, but in the systems they left behind. The Great Wall and the Star Fort were two different answers to the same lethal equation. How much is a civilization willing to pay to feel safe? The Ming Dynasty chose to spend human capital. Their 8,851.8-kilometer system was held together by an inflexible administrative hierarchy that prioritized the collective over the individual. It was a solution that favored stability over innovation, locking the empire into a defensive mindset that lasted for centuries. Across the ocean, the Star Fort forced a different kind of evolution. Because these geometric puzzles were too expensive for any single ruler to pay for in cash, they triggered a revolution in finance. To survive the age of gunpowder, European states had to develop the tools of modern capitalism, central banking, public debt, and the mobilization of liquid capital. The fortress didn't just protect the city, It built the foundations of the modern state. By the time the age of the Invincible Wall ended in the 19th century, the world had fundamentally changed. One path led to a massive, centralized bureaucracy strained by the weight of its own maintenance. The other led to a competitive, credit-driven system where survival depended on financial and technical agility. Because the Star Fort was too expensive to fund through traditional means, it forced European states to innovate their institutional architecture, pioneering central banking and public debt to finance their geometric ambitions. While the Ming Wall preserved a labor-based hierarchy, the Star Fort unintentionally built the financial engine of global dominance. History does not favor the most fortified, but the most agile, those who trade the permanence of stone for the fluidity of systems. These stone giants were never just shields, they were the divergent operating systems of the modern world.